Good afternoon. I'd like to go over two new additions to the servo cable FAQ that's on our community site. The ACR7000 stepper to ECL motor cables is a one-page PDF. These are the same cables used with the ECL drives. The ECL motors are a nice stepper motor. These extension cables will connect the motor directly into the ACR7000 stepper. So there's a encoder cable and a motor power cable. These are available in lengths of 1, 3, 5, and 10 meters, and these are the part numbers there. Moving on, there's now a spreadsheet for the ACR7000 Servo, P-Series, IPA, Parker servo drive, the PSD, and also the Compax3. So if you open that spreadsheet up, the first sheet is the feedback compatibility. Not all the drives support all the feedback options. So on the ACR7000, that supports BIS-C and incremental encoders. The IPA supports, let me zoom in here a little bit. The IPA supports BIS-C, incremental encoders, hyperface DSL, and hide-and-hide INDAT. The P-Series supports BIS-C, incremental encoder, and hide-and-hide INDAT. The PSD, Parker Servo Drive, supports a hyperface DSL, and we're now supporting the incremental encoder and the resolver. Compax3 supports incremental encoder, hide-and-hide INDAT, and resolver. On the second sheet, we have the ACR7000 to motor cables. So like we said, we support the BIS-C and the incremental encoders on the 7000 Servo. The P-Series and the PMDD are both BIS-C motors. These are the motor power cables. The brake cable is a separate cable on the P-Series motor if you need that. The feedback cable, and then the feedback with the battery. For the P-Series with the battery, that gives you the multi-turn absolute encoder support. The PMDD is just a single turn P-Series direct drive motor, so there's only the option for the feedback cable. These are the standard non-flexing cables, and then we also have high flex cables available as standard on the P-Series rotaries. These cables are in lengths of meters. The mm is in meters, so we have standard lengths of 3, 5, 10, and 20 meters. For the incremental encoder motors, the SM motor is available with the E incremental encoder, which is a 1000 line, and the motor power cable is a P-1A1-10 for a 10-foot, and then the F-1A1-10 would be a 10-foot feedback cable on there. So these are the same cables used on the BE as well too. The motor power cable has the brake leads wired into it, so you do not need a separate brake cable if the motor happens to have a brake. The high flex cable is really easy. It's just instead of P-1A1-10, it's now PH-1A1-10. So, and these are in lengths of feet. 10, 25, and 50 are standard lengths. We also do 5-foot increments, so a P-1A1-05 would be a 5-foot. We'll do any 5-foot increment up to 50 as well too. And then the high flex feedback cable is a FH-1A1. The IPA to motor cables is on the next sheet. The IPA supports BIS-C incremental encoders and also hide-and-hide INDAT. It's available in 120 and 240 volts AC. With the higher power range, I went ahead and added the larger motors. So the P-Series, the IPA feedback connector is the same as the 7000 Servo. So these cables are the same as the 7000 Servo. And then the same thing with a high flux, and then the incremental encoders, it's the same P1A1 and the F1A1. Now on the larger motors, like the BE342 and above, the motor power cable needs to be bumped up to the P-3B1. It's the same motor power connector size, but it's a larger cable itself for a larger current capacity. So it's a 20 amp cable instead of a 6 amp cable. And then the feedback does not change. That's still the F-1A1. And then the MPP and the MPJ, those start in a 92 millimeter frame size and go all the way up to 270 millimeter. You wouldn't use the really large motors on an IPA because it's current limited, but depending on what size motor, the length, and the winding letter, pick the appropriate motor power cable here. And the feedback cable does not change. That's still F-1A1. The Heidenhain INDAT, the motor power cable is the same. Just go based on this chart here. The Heidenhain INDAT, the 8D is the option for the MPP and the MPJ series. And then the feedback cable is the F-1A2. The Heidenhain INDAT has the advantage it does not require a battery. The multi-turn capability is based on gears inside of it, mechanical, not with a battery on there. And so that's the F-1A2 feedback cable for the Heidenhain INDAT to the IPA. And then we also have the high flex cables listed here. On the next sheet, we have the P-series drive to motor power cables. Let me zoom in here a little bit. Obviously, the P-series motors to the P-series drives would work. Those are BIS-C, very cost-effective metric motors. The motor power cable is the same as what's listed on the other sheets. Those are listed here. Those are, again, available in meters. The feedback connector is a 3M high-density connector on the P-series drive. So it's a APCS-EN MMES, where the MM is the length in meters, and then with the battery, if you need the multi-turn absolute capability, it would be the ES1. You just add the 1 on the end of that, and that adds the battery to the feedback cable. And so we also have the high flex versions of those cables, the P-series direct drive. It's a APCS PN MMYS, or the ZS. The YS is the motor power cable. The ZS is the feedback cable. It's a little bit different connector since they're a higher resolution and larger current on some of those motors. The MPP MPJ new, it has the 4B option, which is a BIS-C absolute encoder on there. The P-1A1P is the motor power cable. So instead of the P-1A1-10, it will now be the P-1A1P-10. And I'll come back to that in a minute, and I'll explain why we added the P on there. The feedback cable is a F-4B1 cable, and that'll be in lengths of feet. The incremental encoder is supported with the P-series drives. That has long been available. The SM and the BE, the SM with the E encoder, the BE with the J encoder, the MPP, the MPJ with the 1E incremental encoder. The motor power cable will be the P-1A1. On the larger BE motors would be the P-3B1P, meaning P-series. And then the MPP, MPJ would be based on the similar chart. So depending on the size, it'll either be the P-1A1P or the P-3B1P. And then the feedback cable is all the same. It's F-4A1-10, 25, or 50. The Heidenhain INDAT, the MPP, MPJ with the 8D is the standard option on there. So if you're looking for an upgrade path on old Aries drives with the 8D, or even the 7D or the 6D or the 9D on the previous versions, that will also work with the P-series. the feedback cable would be the F-4A2, and then the motor power cable can be reused, but it would be the P-1A1P or the P-3B1P. So let me digress right now and explain the P option on the motor power cable. If we take a look at the P-Series user guide on the front cover, you'll notice if you zoom in, you've got the line power, and that's for the AC power. You've got the I/O connector, and then you've got the motor connector, which is U, V, and W. Right here is actually the ground for the motor, so that needs to be connected with the green wire. Our standard cable, the green wire, ground wire, isn't long enough to reach there. So what we've done on the P is the P-1A1P and the P-3B1P, we've added a longer ground wire on there to reach the heat sink and also add the O-ring terminal on there. So hopefully that explains that, makes it a little bit easier rather than having to strip back the cable and modify that in the field. Okay, so moving on to the next sheet, we have the new PSD Parker Servo drive. It's been released for a while with the 6H option with a hyperface DSL. It's a single connector on the MPP MPJ. That's the 6H option on there that has the motor power and the motor feedback all in one cable. And so there's two different size cables, one for a 20 amp up to 20 amp and the other one up to 30 amp. And that has the brake leads in there if the motor happens to have a brake as well. The incremental encoder is now supported on the PSD. The resolver also is now supported on the PSD. So SM motors with the E encoder, the BE with the J encoder, and the MPP, MPJ with the 1E encoder, those would use the P-1A1 or the P-3B1 for the motor power cable. And then for the larger MPP, MPJ, again, similar as before, look at the chart. Depending on the frame size and the current and the winding letter will tell you which size motor power cable. The feedback cable will be the same as the Compax3. It's the F-2C1 cable. It needs to be Rev E. That's the newer version of that cable. That cable has been around for a long time. We had to move a couple pins around. It will be backwards compatible with the Compax3, but for the PSD, it will need to be Rev E on the cable. It will be marked on there. Any new orders will be Rev E. So F-2C1 for the incremental encoder, that's available in lengths in feet. And then the motor power cable will be the P-H-1A1 or the P-H-3B1, and then the high flux feedback cable would be an FH-2C1 and then the length in feet. The resolver is also supported on the PSD. On the SM motor and the BE motors, it is the R resolver option in the part numbering. On the MPP and the MPJ, it is the 41 in the part number. And then the feedback cable is the same. It's the F-2B1 cable. That's the same as we've done and sold with the Compax3 for a really long time. So that will be backwards compatible or give an upgrade path if somebody wanted to retrofit the machine. So I went ahead and added the Compax3 as well too. We are still selling it. It's been around a long time. It's a really good drive. It supports different feedback options. It supports the incremental encoder and the Heidenhain INDAT. It also supports resolvers. So on the SM motors with the PS connectors, the E is the encoder option on the SM motor, the J encoder on the BE, and the MPP MPJ is the 1E option on there. Those would use the F-2C1 cables. And the motor power cables we've gone over, similar to the other drives, it would be the P-1A1, 3B1 for the larger BE motors, and then on the MPP, MPJ, just look at the chart here. The Compax3 does go all the way up to 155 amps. So depending on what motor it is, it may, we do have the larger chart here, including the larger MPP motors. Those are all in lengths of feet, and we do have high flex versions of those. So again, just change the P to a PH or the F to an FH. The incremental encoder on the Compax3 is the F12 option. So the SO63V2 F12 is the incremental encoder. The F12 option will also support in the Heidenhain INDAT, with the Heidenhain INDAT, which is a standard option on the MPP and the MPJ, with the 8D option. That is the F-2A2 cable, is the feedback cable. The motor power cable is the same as the incremental encoder on there. So the F-2A2, again, with the Heidenhain INDAT, it works with the MPP, MPJ with the 8D. Would also work with the previous 7D, 6D, and 9D INDAT encoders. The resolver is the R option on the SM and the BE motors, or the 41 option on the MPP and the MPJ. That uses the F-2B1 cable, and then the motor power cable doesn't change. So regardless of the size, the feedback connector is always the same size. And then the other thing to add is that on the resolver, it is compatible with the Compax3 with the F10 feedback option. So let's say it's a Compax3 SO63V2 F10. The F10 supports the resolver feedback option on the motors on there. So that is a different hardware than the F12, which is for the incremental encoder and the INDAT on there. So, all right. So that spreadsheet covers basically all the newer products, including the older Compax3, which is still available, and we will continue making and selling those foreseeable future. But this spreadsheet goes over all the different options with the different feedback options with the servo drives. So if you have any questions, feel free to email us at emn_support@parker.com. Thank you and have a great day. Bye-bye.